Makahanya haramita shingyo Genji saiboza gyojin hanya haramita jishoken gon gai gudo esai gu yaku sharishi shikifui.
Obaku and the Tiger. Later the master went to the capital, and there someone advised him to go and pay a visit to Baizhang. The master asked Baizhang, "How have the Chan school's teachings been given from of old?" Baizhang was silent for a long time. "Do not let the teaching be lost to future generations," said the master. "Just about to say that you are the one," replied Baizhang. Then he got up and went to his quarters. The master followed him in, saying, "This fellow comes especially." Baizhang said, "This being so, he had better not be ungrateful to me." Baizhang asked the master one day, "Where have you come from?" "From the foot of Daxiong mountain, picking mushrooms," replied the master. "Were there any tigers to be seen there?" asked Baizhang. The master then roared like a tiger. Baizhang picked up an axe and made as if to chop. The master boxed his ear. Baizhang laughed uproariously and returned to the monastery. There he ascended the podium and said to the assembly, "At the foot of Daxiong mountain there is a big tiger. All of you must keep a good lookout for him. Old fellow Baizhang has already been bitten today." These are two further stories of Master Obaku, or Huangpo, to give him his Chinese name, and these are his encounters with Baizhang. And the first encounter has to do with the transmission itself. After all, this is an extract from the records of the transmission of the lamp. And the second has to do, as we heard, with the encounter with the mountain tiger, which we'll look at shortly. But to begin with, let's just have a slightly closer look at this initial meeting. As usual, one goes to the master and asks a question. It's quite rare, and we've said this before, necessarily for the masters to say very much. They gave their teishos once a day in the monastery, but otherwise they were quite remote. And if you happen to meet a master, then you asked the question. And that put the emphasis on the one who came, usually on the student. But here we have two great Zen masters encountering each other. And the older one, Baizhang, encounters the younger one, Obaku. And we see, first of all, actually, that Obaku, it was suggested to him that he actually pay Baizhang a visit. So one suspects that there was something going on a little bit here for that suggestion to be made. Baizhang, probably getting a little bit old by then, may there's always that question of the succession. How does the Dharma get transmitted? And we remember that when the Buddha was close to his own death at the parinirvana, he was asked the same question: "Who will be your successor?" And the Buddha replied, saying that no one person would be the successor, but the Dharma, that's the teachings, the doctrines and so forth, and the Vinaya, the rules of practice, those would be the successor. And when he was then asked, well, what language should they be translated into? Which of the two holy languages, either Sanskrit or Pali? The Buddha replied that they should be translated into any language that was necessary in order to spread the Dharma, in order to pass it on. And not only any language, but any dialect as well. What was most important was not the sacred language, but that people should actually understand it. And this is something that has always been the case in the teaching of Buddhism and in the transmission itself. Buddhism is not a static thing. It's not a static religion, but it's something that changes and adapts. However, it's not just a matter of changing it willy-nilly. It can only really be changed by one who has gone through the process, him or herself. Someone who understands the spirit, because it's important that the spirit is transmitted, not just the bare forms. In fact, there is a caution by the Buddha against just practicing empty rites and rituals. This is known as something that is not conducive at all. When an empty rite or an empty form becomes passed on, and the spirit of the thing is lost. And there's a nice example actually given by the late Trevor Leggett on this. Trevor Leggett, who was almost single-handedly brought judo to the UK, was once watching a kendo display. Kendo is swordsmanship, Japanese swordsmanship, but often practiced using wooden poles in place of actual swords. And in this particular one, they were commemorating a particular famous kendo master. And one particular event, one of the kendo martial artists came out with the usual kendo stick, and the other one came out with what looked like two leather-covered saucepan lids. And they encountered, and one with the saucepan lids was able to parry each of the blows that the other one was giving with the wooden sword. And afterwards, Trevor Leggett asked his companion about this, who was a kendo master himself, what was that about? And he said, "Oh, well, this commemorates a famous event when the master was attacked by surprise by a rival who sought to assassinate him, and he happened to be in the kitchen at the time. And the only thing he could find to pick up, well, the first thing he found to pick up, were two saucepan lids. And so he used the saucepan lids to successfully evade the attack. And from that time, this story was told and is commemorated by this particular display. And Trevor Leggett, commenting, said, "What a pity that it had become that something that was so spontaneous had actually become so stylized over the years." And he commented that this is something that humans have a tendency to do. We get stuck in the form of things rather than actually transplanting the spirit of the thing. And actually, there's another rather nice story about the kendo as well, or the swordsman, and this concerns the young man who wishes to learn swordsmanship, and so he goes to the sword master and asks to be taken on. And the master, as usual, says yes, but you will go and work in the kitchens, which was the usual thing. You worked your way up. And so he did, and he was there for 6 months, and no one taught him anything about swordsmanship at all. And so one day he went to the master and said, "I thought you were going to teach me swordsmanship." And the master simply sent him back to the kitchen again. But then shortly after that, whilst the boy was working, the master crept up on him in the kitchen, and grabbing hold of a wooden stick, he attacked the boy, who managed to run away. And this happened a couple more times, and a couple more times after that, until very quickly the boy began to develop an almost sixth sense to know when somebody was creeping up behind him. And after he had successfully done that, the master called him and said, "Now you have learnt the most important lesson of swordsmanship, and that is the alertness that is necessary in order to be prepared always for an attack. Now we just have to teach you the actual techniques, the methods of sword play and so forth. These are very straightforward, but that sense of how to employ that skill, this is the thing that you cannot teach. This is the thing that you have to acquire by yourself." And so that spontaneity is very important. The forms are there to help us, in fact, although it looks perhaps contradictory at first point when you go into a zendo and everything is the same and everybody's behaving the same. Actually, it's the forms are used to shave off those rough edges and to really open the heart. The forms give us something into which we can give ourselves wholeheartedly. And once we have really learned to do that, then the spontaneity comes quite of itself. The life is actually there. And this is what links these two stories, really, because they do go together. The story of the encounter with Baizhang and the transmission, and also the story about the tiger. So we're looking still at this first story. So the master asks Baizhang, how have the Chan school's teachings been given from of old? Well, if we are familiar with the Chan school, or the Zen school to give it its Japanese name, then we are probably familiar with that 4-line verse from Bodhidharma, or that's ascribed to Bodhidharma, a special transmission outside the teachings, not dependent on words and phrases. And again, as has been pointed out before, Chan arose in reaction, really, to an ever more complicated Mahayana exposition. And that there was this feeling that it had become just a little bit too philosophical, and had lost the vitality, the spontaneity, which of the original awakening of the Buddha. In fact, instead of treating the teachings as a raft for crossing over with and not for seizing hold of, it was precisely what had happened, that the teachings had been seized hold of, continuously elaborated, and although those elaborations were perfectly valid, they didn't touch the heart. They were too intellectual. As Venerable Myokyo-ni used to say, the head always wishes to understand the matter, but the heart is only interested in partaking in life. It's not interested in understanding things. It just wants to partake, to play. So when he asks this question, Baizhang was silent for a long time. Special transmission outside the teachings, not dependent on words and phrases. And it's true, it's not dependent on words and phrases, but that doesn't mean that the words and phrases are rejected, because this would go against, in fact, a well-known saying of Master Rinzai, who in fact was Obaku's pupil or student, when Master Rinzai often used to say, as I see it, nothing is to be rejected. So it's not that the teachings are rejected, and this is a mistake that actually happened somewhat when the Zen teachings came west. There was this feeling now with the iconoclasm, and that we don't have to bother with the teachings and so forth. Actually, we do. If we remember that the Chan arose in reaction to an over-intellectualization, it didn't say that the intellect wasn't necessary at all. As another Zen master puts it, thinking and thought and reasoning and so forth is a wonderful tool, but so is a hammer. However, don't take a hammer fishing. Our problem is simply an over-reliance on it. We attack everything with our thoughts and concepts, and somehow that thinking and conceptualizing distances ourselves from the vitality of living itself, of the living experience. And so we must constantly go back to that. This is where that simplicity comes in. This is why when we go to the temples and the monasteries, we see that much of the day is spent working. And that's because it's in the body. It's working is in and through the body. There is the chance for that vitality to not only be experienced, but also to be obviously put to good use as well. So yes, it may be that the master often shows that vitality not by direct speech, not by direct teaching, but often just by simply living. There's the story also of the student of the master who was with him for some time, and rather like the sword apprentice, felt that he wasn't getting any teachings from his master, and so he decided to go on pilgrimage a bit, and went around, and everywhere he went, all he heard from some very great Zen masters was, my goodness, what a wonderful fellow that master is. And the student was perplexed and went back to his master and said, "Everywhere I go, they sing your praises, and say what a wonderful teacher you are. But all the time I've been with you, you never taught me anything." And the master looked at him, hurt, and said, "Is it not the case that when you offered me rice, I held out my bowl? Is it not the case that when you asked me to pass the water jug, that I gave it to you?" And in that moment, the student awoke. We don't recognize it that actually what the teaching is, the heart of the teaching is that being at one with the circumstances and responding to the circumstances, as the circumstances respond to us as well. We are part of it. The difference is that when we intellectualize, when we are too much in the head, then we are always stepping back. We're stepping out of life to look at the river, which can be a useful thing. Obviously, it's very useful to be able to do that. But if we're caught by that, then being out of the river of life, no longer being in the flow of life, somehow everything grows bland. Things become flavorless. And so we then immediately must jump back in once more. It's exactly the same when we do practice Zazen, for example. We get lost in thinking, and then we sort of run out of steam, and then suddenly we become aware that we've sort of drifted off and it's all become a bit boring and dull. That boring and dull is that lifelessness. So then we jump back in one and give ourselves. And as soon as we do that, really give ourselves with a little bit of oomph, then the feeling comes back into it, the life comes back into it. So the master replies to this silence, responds to this silence. "Do not let the teaching be lost to future generations." Precisely this, the silence itself, if I grasp at it, well, if no one understands it, what's the point? This is, after all, the Buddha himself taught for 45 years. He didn't just sit under the Bodhi tree. He taught those whose eyes are but little covered with dust, and he showed how to do it. And he, of course, is always the prime example with this. "Just about to say that you are the one," replied Baizhang. In other words, that he was going to be the one to receive the Dharma transmission. Then he got up and went to his quarters. The master followed him, saying, "This fellow comes especially." So here now is perhaps the reason we can see now why the master came along to see Baizhang when it was suggested that he do so. And Baizhang said, "This being so, he had better not be ungrateful to me," which is perhaps a little bit tongue-in-cheek, because he did come along after all, so it's unlikely that he would perhaps be ungrateful. And actually that gratitude is important, because when it comes to the Dharma, it's said that we owe a debt of gratitude to those who have gone before us, who have kept the path open and have allowed us to benefit from the teaching of the Dharma. Quite often we do think about, what the Dharma can do for me, and if we can paraphrase JFK, it's a little bit more what we can do for the Dharma, because once we give ourselves into it, once we're partaking of it, then we serve it. And in that service, that's where we find our fulfillment too, because we found our place in the Dharma, and we've also, not perhaps, we could say found our meaning, a little bit, but only insofar as we've become one. We've become one with something greater than myself. In other words, this provides the release from the narrow confine of I, me, and mine. Then we have the next story. Baizhang asked the master one day, "Where have you come from?" "From the foot of Dagshong mountain, picking mushrooms," replied the master. "Were there any tigers to be seen there?" asked Baizhang. The master then roared like a tiger. That tiger is a solitary animal that lurks in the jungle or in the mountain, and actually his associations are often with death. The tiger is greatly feared because you don't see him. until the last minute, until he pounces on you. So he's rather like death, really. We live in ignorance of death, our own death, and then suddenly it's upon us. We reach a certain age and we look around and we suddenly realise that the generation ahead of us have all gone, and now it's our generation, my generation, that's next, and suddenly the colour drains from our cheeks and so on. And of course, life is very precarious in this way, and it's a common practice in all religions to that memento mori, to be aware of our own mortality, because it gives a certain intensity. It's not morbid. This isn't about a sort of morbidness about death and dying. It's just that awareness of the preciousness of one's own life, and therefore not to waste it. I mean, if we really feel that each moment is precious, then the idea of wasting this life would be something that we wouldn't feel so inclined to do. It's when we take life for granted that we waste life, and that doesn't mean that we therefore have to be always doing something. Doing something can also be a way of escaping life. It doesn't have to do with how much we do. It has to do with the depth to which we taste this moment of life, or this period of life, to really be able to experience it deeply. It may be that we can do nothing, literally nothing, in which case to experience that. When we sit in an armchair, perhaps when we come back from work, after a long day's work, why not take 20 minutes just to sit quietly in a comfortable armchair, nothing to do, don't have to smoke a cigarette or make a coffee or phone somebody up or check my Facebook profile or anything. We can just sit there. And what usually happens? Well, what usually happens is fairly quickly I go off into one of my thought streams. But if we really look at those thought streams, are they not a type of avoidance? That somehow we don't wish to experience this moment in which there might not be very much going on for me, which I may judge as not very important or a bit boring, but that we are not prepared to experience that moment just as it is. If we are, then actually the quality of that experience deepens and becomes more profound. So this is why death is often seen as something important. It reminds us of the importance of living life fully, living this moment as fully as possible. So the master, having been picking mushrooms, was asked were there any tigers to be seen there. But tigers also are mammals. They're big cats, obviously. And we have to also remember that the big cats feature very much in Buddhism. The Buddha, it was said to ride on a lion. His teachings were known as the lion's roar as well. So they're also associated with great power. And in fact, that great power is that great power of life with a capital L. And it's personified in many ways. Those who are familiar with the bull herding pictures, what are sometimes perhaps also erroneously called the ox herding pictures. It's not really an ox, it is a bull. A bull is a capricious creature. An ox is a beast of burden that's rather compliant. And in this case, we're talking about that rather feisty, unpredictable energy of the emotional household. There's a well-known painting on the roof, on the ceiling, of one of the temples in Myoshinji, of a dragon that was painted by the great painter Ganyu. And when he was originally commissioned to do so by the then abbot, when he agreed to paint this dragon, because he was famous for painting dragons, the master asked him, he said, the only stipulation is that you should paint this dragon on our ceiling from life. Have you ever seen a dragon? And The artist was rather taken aback and had to admit that he had never seen a dragon. So the master said, well, the abbot said, well, go and see one. Go and look one out and see it, and then you can paint it from life. And the artist said, well, I don't know where to find them. And so the abbot said, oh, well, come to Myoshinji. We have plenty of them there. So the artist said, oh, all right. So he came along, and the abbot said, can you see them? And the artist said no. So the master said, well, perhaps you should stay here for a little while until you do. So he did. He stayed for a year. And one day he comes running in to see the master and says, I've seen one. And the abbot said, good. He said, and did you hear it roar? And the artist had to admit that he hadn't heard it roar. So the abbot said, well, stay a little bit longer, which he did. And finally, he then painted this magnificent Myoshinji dragon, which you can, if you Google it, you can find it. And a few years ago, or some time ago, there was an earthquake that brought down part of the ceiling, and it was said that the earthquake had been caused because the dragon had moved his tail. And everybody seems to agree that the dragon has a particular liveliness about him that's caught in that picture. It can only be done from life. Baizhang asked the master, where have you come from? Then asked, were there any tigers to be seen there? The master then roared like a tiger. Baizhang picked up an axe and made as if to chop. Well, if it really was a tiger, that's what you would do. Of course, there is this wonderful play going on. And this, again, we have to remember that the great masters are teaching. This is not just a game for its own, just for its own sake, although in one sense it is. But it's recorded because it's showing something. It's showing that vitality. The master boxed his ear. Baizhang laughed uproariously and returned to the monastery. There he ascended the podium and said to the assembly, at the foot of Dakshong mountain there is a big tiger. All of you must keep a good lookout for him. Old fellow Baizhang has already been bitten today. Which is a rather good commendation of Master Obaku, who of course would become a great master in his own right, and not only form his own school of Chan, but also he was the master of Master Rinzai Gigan, who of course his school still exists today in its present form. So our school, the Rinzai school, still very much has that flavour of Obaku, that wonderful lightness, that full vitality, that tiger, that roar that comes from the bottom of one's heart. And this really shows quite clearly something of the attitude. It's the ideas that I get about the practice that get in the way, whether it's about what I think Buddhism is about, or how a Buddhist should be, and all that sort of thing. These are all my ideas, and when it comes to it, they don't really go very deep at all. But that life goes right to the very source. It has no form and no shape in itself, but is quite unmistakable when it appears, whether it's at the foot of the mountain picking mushrooms, whether it's painting a ceiling, whether it's that roar, or whether it's a boxing ear. It's quite unmistakable. Well, we'll leave it there for now.